Well, shalom, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for allowing me to stand before you tonight and tell you a bit about my story and how it relates to the book of Job, and specifically how it relates to the concept of Job's comforters. I can't tell you what an honor it is for me to be standing before you here today, inside your own sanctuary, no less. Beautiful sanctuary, by the way. I would especially like to thank Pastor Jacobson for allowing me to speak to you at length here this evening. You know, up until now, people have only given me maybe 2 minutes to try to explain something that just can't possibly be explained in a short period of time. So again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for letting me speak to you today. I'm going to do my very best to make it worth your while for being here. And I'm really glad to see such a wonderful turnout here tonight. You know, to be honest, when I came in and I saw that they had written on the sign outside what the topic of this talk was about, I was afraid nobody would show up. Making any reference to Job on that sign it's kind of like inviting people to come and hear me speak about income taxes or politicians or kidney stones. And let's face it, all of these things do tend to cause a lot of pain and discomfort. Now, before I tell you any specifics about my story, I need to make one thing perfectly clear. Because if you don't understand this one thing, then frankly, I have no business standing in front of you speaking to you tonight. Because if you don't understand this one thing, what happened to me is just another case of another person suffering their own personal trial and tribulation. And let's face it, everybody suffers terrible trials and tribulations to varying degrees throughout their lives. So for me to stand before you and claim that I have something special to say when I'm just suffering the same kind of problems that everyone else is suffering would be ludicrous. I have no business doing that unless I can put some kind of a spin or give you some kind of a specific insight. I have no business speaking to you in that case. I'm here to assure you that what happened to me is different than what happens to other people. And it's different in the same way that what happened to Job is different than what happens to other people. I can relate to Job's experience better than most people, not because I suffered the same thing that he did. He lost everything and he became physically sick to the point of painful boils all over his body. I have not suffered that. I have suffered something else that is equally painful in its own right. But what makes the story that Job and I have to tell unique is this. It is absurd, it is strange, it is bizarre, it's inexplicable, it is surreal. It doesn't make any rational sense at all. And on my website, I use the phrase Kafkaesque. If you've ever read Kafka, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a life experience that is so bizarre that it makes Alice in Wonderland look like Leave It to Beaver normality. That's what makes what happened to me and what happened to Job similar and different from what most people experience. Now, there's people out there who have cancer. There's people out there whose children have died. There are people out there suffering terrible tragedies. I am not standing before you to tell you that I have suffered the worst tragedy as such that anyone has ever suffered. That is not the case. There are Christians being beheaded and raped and sexually enslaved and tortured all around the world today. I am not here to tell you I have suffered more than they have. I'm here to tell you that my experience is bizarre. And when things become that bizarre and they distance themselves so much from reality, there's something significant going on there. So let me tell you about the story briefly to give you a sense of what makes this so strange. On the surface, this is nothing more than a simple problem of somebody who's living quietly in his own home and his neighbors injected loud and violent noise into his house which disturbed him, or into his apartment, which disturbed him at home. On the surface, that is it. And that, let's face it, friends, that ain't a big deal. I mean, I've lived in places before that had loud neighbors. I think just about everybody has, right? There's nothing special about that. Here is what makes it so absurd. My apartment lease prohibited the noise. We have noise laws at various levels that prohibit that kind of noise and harassment. The state of Minnesota spends millions of dollars building noise barriers all along the highway to protect people from this noise for some reason. So there's this acknowledgement that there's something wrong with noise. And yet, over 3 years, not one person in the state of Minnesota in a position of authority, from the bottom, my landlord, all the way up to my state legislator, not one of these people ever did anything to stop this noise. And when I say they did nothing, I mean they didn't do their jobs. They didn't do what they were paid to do, what they accepted a paycheck to do. For example, a police officer is charged with enforcing the law. There's a very clearly written noise law on the books. It almost sounds like it was written to describe exactly what was happening to me. Yet the police refused to enforce it. Not only that, but they blamed the victim and protected the perpetrator. And this is another thing that I experienced all the way from the bottom to the top. My landlord blamed the victim. He claimed that I was hypersensitive to noise. Now my website dispels that ridiculous myth very easily. The police blamed the victim. They said, well, they implied you should just move away, and then you don't have to deal with it anymore. Well, there's a host of problems with that solution. For one thing, I don't move away from criminals. I expect the police to enforce the law and to stop those criminals. The whole point of having that law and law enforcement is so that I don't have to disrupt my life and move away in response to other people's antisocial behavior. That's the whole point of having a law. If that breaks down, then anything goes. We live in a lawless society. So I stood very strong in favor of enforcing the lease that I and my landlord signed and that the police were charged with enforcing. I went to the New Brighton, where I lived in New Brighton, Minnesota. I went to the city council, and they just sent me to the police. They are the ones who wrote and passed the noise ordinance, and yet they didn't care. And at some point, this becomes absurd and surreal to the point where the word Kafkaesque does apply. Why would people write a noise clause into their lease if they have no intention of enforcing it? Why would the police take an oath of office and put on that uniform and stand proud as a respectable member of society and then refuse to do the job they're paid to do? Why would a city council go through the effort of writing and passing a noise ordinance if they had no intention of ever enforcing it? And here's where it gets even more absurd. When the noise that I experienced happens to them, they suddenly feel compelled to enforce it. Now this goes all the way up to my state legislator, who also did absolutely nothing. Now you have to understand what this is like. When you are inside your home and you basically have somebody who's invading your home, it's a home invasion. Someone is injecting energy into my home constantly. And that noise disrupts my home life. I can feel it in my body. It makes objects in my room shake. It prevents me from concentrating. It prevents me from thinking clearly. It wakes me up when I'm asleep, and it prevents me from getting to sleep when I'm awake, and I need to get to sleep so I can go to work the next day. So noise is a very serious issue. I use the analogy, if someone stood outside my apartment and they had a hose and they sprayed gasoline into my windows, they're injecting something into my home, into my space that I'm paying for, that I call a home. Now, what they're injecting in there is dangerous, and therefore you would expect the police would come over and they would stop them from doing that, and they would punish the perpetrator. Okay, what happened in my case was someone spraying gasoline into my home, and the police come over and they tell me, well, if you don't like it, why don't you move away? And they just let the perpetrator do whatever they want. It's absolutely absurd. It makes no sense. And when you go through this for 3 full years and not one person, there's 5 million people in Minnesota, Not one person comprehended what I was trying to tell them. That this noise was not just disruptive, it was absolutely destroying my life. Now here's where it gets even more absurd. I went out, unlike these other people, I went out and researched noise pollution and its effects on people. And I found that there's no less than 23 academic journals that touch in some manner on the issue of the relationship between noise and human health. Psychological health, emotional health, physical health, and in fact spiritual health as well. 23 academic journals. There's even a journal called Noise and Health. Okay, so obviously academia has known for a long time that noise is dangerous to human health. And in fact, it turns out it's very dangerous. And it's very well documented. But also, I found that noise has been used as a weapon by people who initiate violence against other people, really from the beginning of recorded time. I mean, we're all familiar with the walls of Jericho. Apparently, noise brought down the walls of Jericho. Now, of course, you could argue it was a miracle from God, or you could argue that, well, God knows the nature of noise, and he told them to make precisely the noise that would resonate and weaken the structure of the walls and make them fall. You know, whichever the case is, the point is noise was relevant there one way or another. But even if you want to ignore that, the fact is an army that comes over the hill silently and all you hear is footsteps and they've got their sabers in the air, that's pretty scary. But when they come over the hill with a rebel yell, blood-curdling, terrorizing, screaming of 10,000 men, that is terrifying. Now, noise was used at Waco. If you remember the siege at Waco, the FBI, after there were 76 men, women, and children locked inside their own home, inside their church, and I've been there, I've been to Waco. That place was not much bigger than the house that I grew up in. They used long lenses on television to make it look like it was a huge compound. It was not a very big building, and you had 76 men, women, and children trapped in there, besieged by an extremely aggressive, heavily armed, vicious, militarized police. What did they do? They cut off these people's electricity so they're in the dark, cut off their access to outside supplies and food and health, first aid, and they used noise as a weapon. And the specific reason that they did this was to disorient and to terrify these people. It was to get them off balance so that they couldn't function properly. Now, why would they do that if noise didn't serve that purpose? And what you find is that militaries and police departments, the FBI, any group that initiates violence against others, long ago figured out that noise is a very effective weapon, especially if you want to incapacitate an enemy. In World War II, Japanese soldiers would slip up next to the camps of sleeping U.S. soldiers, and they would just tap with sticks and wood on trees. They're not yelling and screaming, they're just tapping. That it's like the Chinese water torture, only an audio version of it. It absolutely terrified these soldiers, and they couldn't sleep, and many of them went crazy, or they went AWOL, or they were just so tired that they weren't very effective the next day in battle and they got slaughtered. There were publications in the U.S. military warning that this was an effective tactic of war. So the absurdity of my situation is that when I'm enduring something like that inside my own home, and over 3 years, I can't get one person in the state of Minnesota to acknowledge that that's even a problem, let alone a problem that needs a solution other than me bearing all of the burden of time, effort, expense, and life disruption to move away. If I can't find one person in 3 years when they are paid to do just that, they're paid to enforce these noise laws and to enforce the lease and to take action against these kind of perpetrators, my friends, that is an absurd situation. And as if the noise wasn't bad enough, it was this increasing butting heads against these people who refused to do their job that really introduced what I can only call trauma into my life. That is what really ultimately incapacitated me inside my own home. In the end, I'm going to cut this story a bit short. In the end, all of this led to me losing everything I had worked my entire life for. Every possession, all my money, my life savings, all the research I had done since the late 1980s that I've carried around with me at great expense my whole life. Everything that is my life is now gone, except for a car that I live in and what I can put in the car, a couple of items in storage. I have lost absolutely everything. And none of this would have happened if any of those people in those 3 years had just done their job. Or if people who did not have a job to do, like friends and coworkers, people who claimed to care about me, if they had mobilized and taken a moral stand and stood up against these authorities who were not doing their jobs, and they had pressured and compelled these people to do their jobs. Now, along those lines, I have to point out another element of this. The media in Minnesota, the news media, I approached every mainstream and alternative media I could find in the state of Minnesota. Not only did they not see a story worth reporting here, all of this total, utter negligence, incompetence, apathy, and corruption. Not only did they not see a story there, but they wouldn't even listen to the story when I approached them. It was like those monkeys that, put their hands over their eyes, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. They just didn't, it was as if I was talking about a taboo, but I was talking about noise. I'm not sure how noise becomes a taboo in society. I wasn't talking about pornography or child molestation or some perversion. This is just something that everybody's exposed to. You would think that just as a responsible news media, they would investigate and report on something like this, because noise affects a whole bunch of people, not just me. It affects most people, I would dare to say. And yet the news media just didn't care. They did not care. They would not publicize this story, and they would not hold officials accountable for their absolute total failure to do the jobs that they accept a paycheck for doing. Okay? So the absurdity and injustice that I endured is just surreal. You would think in 3 years, at least one person somewhere out of 5 million Minnesotans would do the right thing, but instead, not even one did it. Okay, so that's just the basics of my story. There's a whole lot more to it, but that is the point that makes it so relevant to the book of Job. Because what happened to Job made no sense. He didn't deserve it, and nobody did the right thing to help him. And that's where we're going to get into the topic of Job's comforters. But before that, then we have to take a look at the book of Job itself and see what the book is all about. So let's begin by putting the book of Job in its proper historical context in the timeline of history. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That was about 6,000 years ago, or 4,000 BC. 1,700 years after that, mankind had degenerated to such a point that God decided to destroy the world and to start all over again with Noah's family. And that, of course, was Noah's flood. And when Noah's family got off the boat, there were 8 people that God told to multiply and spread throughout the earth. But what happened instead was that people tended to conglomerate into cities. I mean, don't forget, they were all family. And a few generations after Noah, while Noah was still alive, Nimrod founded the city of Babylon. And in Babylon, of course, they built the Tower of Babel, and they were basically shaking their fist at God and saying, no, we're not going anywhere. We're staying right here, and we are going to make a name for ourselves. And God retorted by saying, no, you're not. I told you to spread about the earth. That's exactly what you'll do. So God confounded their languages, and that split them into tribes. And tribes, when they can't communicate with each other, they lose sight of the fact that they're related. And eventually they start to distrust each other, they start to envy each other, they start to want to steal and enslave each other, they want to go to war. That's what caused the dispersion of people after the flood. One of the places that these people migrated to after the Tower of Babel fell was northern Africa, where they founded the kingdom of Egypt. And of course, Egypt plays a large role in Old Testament history. But about 300 years after the flood, and this is while Noah was still alive, a man named Abraham was born in Mesopotamia. Abraham was chosen by God to be the vehicle by which he would create a great nation, which would be his chosen people on earth. And by chosen, of course, we mean the people who would deliver the Messiah, who would save mankind from the sin that caused the fall. So Abraham, we all know the story of Abraham, but that was 300 years after the flood. The flood was 1,700 years after creation, so Abraham was about 2,000 years after creation, which is also about 2,000 years before Jesus Christ's first coming. And Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob had, well, many sons, but his youngest son was named Joseph. And Joseph ended up in Egypt, where he became Pharaoh's right-hand man. Now remember, this is Egypt. Throughout that time, that's when Egypt was building up into the empire that it was by that time. When there was a famine, Joseph's family moved to Egypt to get food, and when they met up with Joseph, they stayed there. And under the protection of this large empire, Egypt, they were able to grow in numbers. That's where the Hebrews really multiplied. Now, about 400 years after that, Moses was called by God for yet another mission. His job was to bring this now very numerous group of Hebrews out of Egypt and back to the promised land that God had promised to Abraham. Now, along the way, they stopped at Mount Sinai, and that's where God gave Moses the 10 Commandments and the law. So when the Hebrews arrived in Canaan and they took over the land and they became the Israelites and they established their own nation there, they were under the law of Moses and the 10 Commandments. Now, that's a whole story of its own. It's impossible to keep the law. That's actually the point of the law. It was never to save you by keeping the law. It was to prove that it's impossible for you to keep the law, and that's why you need a Savior, specifically Jesus Christ. Again, everything in the Bible ultimately points to Christ. Unfortunately, as the Israelites, when they took over Canaan and it became Israel, and they tried to manage things on their own, they just kept blowing it over and over and over again. They had judges, they had kings, they had prophets. No matter what form of government they had, they just could not remain faithful to God. They kept falling away from God and disobeying God, and they had to be punished each and every time, including the great captivity back to, of all places, Babylon. Now, the very last book in the Old Testament is the book of Malachi. Malachi lived about 400 years before Christ, and he delivered the very last message in the Old Testament to the Israelites. And sadly, that message basically was, I'm giving up on you. You've failed too many times. You've broken our covenant too many times. That's the bad news. The good news, of course, is found in the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. And there's even better news, because according to the book of Revelation, God has not totally given up on Israel. There will come a time in the last days when Israel is restored to its proper relationship with God, and it finally fulfills its destiny that it could have fulfilled thousands of years ago. And that is the briefest explanation of the timeline of the Old Testament that I can offer you. The question is, where does Job fall into that timeline? According to most traditions and scholars, Job lived somewhere between the Tower of Babel and the time of Abraham, or possibly a generation or two after Abraham. Personally, for my own reasons, I believe Job lived before Abraham, but probably closer to Abraham than to the Tower of Babel. The point, however, is that the book of Job tells us what life was like in the Mesopotamia area during that rather undocumented period between the flood, when civilization was being raised once again after the flood, but before the covenant with Abraham was established by God. What's really interesting about this, though, is that this means the book of Job itself was written long before Moses wrote down the first 5 books of the Bible, or at least the first 5 books are traditionally attributed to Moses. The book of Job was written around the time of Abraham, or in my opinion, slightly before, but somewhere in that neighborhood. That is long before Moses came along. In fact, some scholars believe that the book of Job may be the oldest surviving book in Western civilization. And what makes that so interesting is you have to ask the question, if this is a book that people felt like preserving to the point where it survives even today, when all the other books of that period do not, what did they write about? What was the topic of the book of Job that made it so interesting and relevant, so important to people that they felt a need to preserve it? And I'm here to tell you today that the book of Job is not just a story. It's not just a drama about the suffering of Job. It's not just a moral lesson in patience and having faith in the Lord when times get tough. In fact, the book of Job contains a wealth of information that is useful for tying many of the other books of the Bible together, and also to help us understand many of the themes in the Bible in much more depth and with more clarity. Now, I have a list here. I wrote down many of those themes. I came up with 12 of those themes in addition to the suffering theme that most people associate with the book of Job. I'm not going to read you all 12, but let me just point out a few because they highlight just how much more is in the book of Job. For example, many people don't notice this. It flies right past them for some reason. But the fact is, Satan is mostly discussed in the New Testament. He makes very little appearance in the Old Testament at all, even though he's there right from the very beginning at the Garden of Eden. So if we did not have the book of Job, we would not have an account of how Satan can approach God even after he has fallen. He can still approach God in order to accuse us. And his goal, of course, is to damn us. If the people of Job's time and forward into the nation of Israel were not aware that Satan was working against them in that manner, this topic would not have been brought up until the time of Jesus. So it's very significant that even though that's only a few sentences in the book of Job, it told the entire nation of Israel something that they needed to know. Also, the book of Job actually anticipates ancient Greek literature and the works of Shakespeare. There's a very good understanding of human psychology in the book of Job, and psychology is crucial to writing drama. Now, whether it's a true story or not, the fact is when you sit down and you write the story, if you don't understand human psychology and you're not able to communicate that effectively, it's not going to have the kind of impact on the audience that you want to have. So the book of Job is a very sophisticated book. And along those lines, this means that whoever wrote down the book of Job understood that their audience at that time was intellectually capable and had the attention span to delve into the book of Job and to carefully think about it. Because if you don't think about the book of Job, it's going to be a boring book. It's just going to appear as an endless diatribe about a man who is suffering. It's going to make God look like he's cruel. If you don't have the intellectual capacity to carefully think about the book of Job, you're not going to get out of it what was put into it. So the fact that it was written so long ago, and yet the author understood that their audience could handle the book of Job, tells us something about the people of that time. This book would not have survived this long if the people who read it back then could not grasp the concepts that tend to fly over the heads of modern readers. Let's see here. This one is fascinating to me. The book of Job anticipates the greatest commandment that Jesus gave us in the New Testament. Now, in the New Testament, the scribes asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And don't forget, they were under Mosaic law, so they had 10 commandments plus some 613 aspects of the law that they were supposed to adhere to. So the scribes are asking Jesus, which is the most important? And Jesus' answer in all 4 Gospels, write this down because it's so important. The answer was, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy mind and all thy strength, and love your neighbor likewise. Jesus went on to say that in this one commandment may be found all of the law and all of the prophets. And the book of Job anticipates this greatest commandment, perhaps more than any other book in the Old Testament, if you know how to read the book of Job. Now, I mention this specifically because there's one litmus test that I use often when I evaluate people that I meet. I just ask myself the simple question, what would the world be like if everyone in the world behaved like this person does? And if the world was filled with people who love the Lord thy God with all their heart and all their soul, all their mind, all their strength, and they love their neighbors likewise, it would be a pretty good world. We wouldn't have things like war and poverty and crime. We wouldn't have the fallen world that we have today. Now, the opposite side of that is, what if we have a world that is filled with people who do not love the Lord at all and who don't make any association whatsoever between loving God and loving their neighbors? Well, in that kind of world, you're going to have people who are basically just looking out for number one. And when they do that, they exploit other people, they take advantage of other people, they neglect other people, they will let other people live in suffering and poverty. This, even before you get to things like war and slavery, the way that people treat each other if they don't love God and they don't love their neighbors as they love God, that kind of world to me is what hell is. It is separation from God, but it's separation from God because we chose to separate ourselves from God by not loving God with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength, and loving our neighbors likewise. So the book of Job is kind of a microcosm drama that emphasizes this point long before Jesus made it so perfectly clear in the four Gospels. And another thing that the book of Job does is it makes a clear distinction between law and proverbs. Now, proverbs are statements that are true most of the time. They're generally true. Laws are always true. So when God says, "Thus saith the Lord," that is true. That is a law. However, when we read the book of Proverbs, a lot of people quote Proverbs to people as if they were absolute truth and what the proverb says always happens. That is not the case. Those are general guidelines, kind of, the first edition of Life's Little Instruction book. And that becomes very important in the book of Job when we find that Job's friends confuse the two. They don't make the distinction between a law and a proverb, and they end up using the proverbs as a weapon to really, really hurt Job. The last point I would like to mention from this list is that Job lived in a time, again, between the flood and the law of Moses. So you have to wonder, at that time, how did you please God? Man had already fallen, but they had not been given the Ten Commandments or the law. They were not yet under grace through Jesus Christ. So how did you become saved? How did you please God during that period of history? And Job's life and Job's example shows us exactly how. But here's the thing. The way that Job did that applies under the law and under grace. Not necessarily for salvation, but in terms of pleasing God. If you want to be a God pleaser rather than a man pleaser, how do you do it? Job shows us how to do it. And with that, let's finally take a look at the book of Job. Please turn with me to chapter 1, verse 1. And verse 1, to me, is one of the most substantial verses in the entire Bible. Now, of course, only when you look at it in context and you link it to all of the other themes that this relates to in the Bible. Taken at face value, it's just transmitting a little bit of information about Job. But there's much, much more than meets the eye here. And frankly, that's the truth for the entire book of Job. But let's look at the verse 1 in some detail here. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. Now that's all they say about Job to start out. The next couple verses talk about the fact that he has 10 children and his camels and animals, his wealth, basically. There are some other verses in the book of Job that talk about his character and add to this. But the fact is, there's really nothing more that needs to be said than verse 1, and that's why not only is it limited to what we read in verse 1, but God himself repeats this twice when he's talking to Satan. So let's take a close look at that. The land of Uz, we don't know where that is, probably Mesopotamia, the general area where Abraham originated from. But then it says, he was perfect and upright. Perfect is one of those words that in English is going to have a different meaning than the original, because obviously Job was not sinless. Nobody has been sinless since the fall. Yet he's described as perfect. And I think one of the best ways to look at this is just when you meet someone and you fall in love with them, you overflow with unconditional love. When you fall in love with someone, you think of them as perfect, and it's so easy to overlook their flaws as if their flaws don't even exist. But over time, as you get closer to them and you spend time with them, and as they say, the honeymoon is over, you start to see those flaws. And yet, those who are capable of unconditional love, those who seek to love others as they love God, which is the greatest commandment, are able for the rest of their lives to maintain this attitude that this person is perfect in their eyes, despite their flaws. So that's what they're referring to here with Job. It also says that he's upright. And what that means is just he's a good man. And, we all know a lot of good people in the world. We know good people in our lives, in our family, and our friends, and at work, and just on the street. But in this case, upright has a much higher standard because it's associated with being perfect. A lot of those people out there who we look at and we think, wow, they are just a really good person. When you look more closely, you start to see the chinks in the armor. Okay, this isn't about losing unconditional love for them and suddenly you see their flaws. It's just that many of the people out there who are in fact really good people, their flaws can be catastrophic. They are a weird dichotomy of very good and not necessarily evil, but significant flaws. But Job is described here in a manner that really limits his flaws. He doesn't seem to really have any, or if the flaws that he has are quite minor. From other verses in the book of Job, we learn that upright means that he is good to his family, he's successful in business, he's a straight shooter and a square dealer in business. He's an honest man, if you can imagine such a thing in business. And he treats his servants well. He honors and values his servants as if they were members of his family. He takes care of widows and orphans and welcomes strangers into his home and takes care of strangers. These are the very things that throughout the Bible are kind of the litmus test for a truly good person. And especially in this day and age where everyone, stranger danger, people are just terrified of strangers. The idea of inviting a stranger into your home seems like absolutely terrifying. And it's a shame because nothing has changed. There was just as much of a chance in Job's time that a stranger who comes up and says that they could really use a warm night's sleep or a warm meal, there was just as much of a chance then that person could have robbed them blind and hurt their children or done something terrible. Yet Job did it. He did it, and we generally don't. That's why he's described as perfect and upright. Then it says that he feared God and eschewed evil. And these are kind of two sides of the same coin. Fearing God is, again, another problem with the English translation. When we hear fear, we think of cowering in the corner with our hands over our heads and sleeping with one eye open and, just, oh my gosh, I hope God doesn't punish me for this. Oh no, oh no. That is not what it's talking about. That's not what God wants with us. That's not the kind of relationship he wants with us. He wants a wonderful relationship with us. But God's holiness, God's goodness, God's power, God is so far above us, it demands that we take a humble role in that relationship. It has to. If we don't take a humble role, if we put on any pride or arrogance or any airs that we even come close to the power or the holiness of God, then we have blown that relationship right then and there. And that's without even looking the other direction toward outright evil. That's just failing to recognize our proper role with respect to our Creator. When it says that Job feared God, it means he understood that relationship, and he sought and cultivated and developed that relationship with God. He respected God. He worshiped God. He loved God. He wanted God in his life. And I would say more than anything else, he was conscious of God. As he went through his daily business, Job was the kind of person who always had God on his mind. He's always talking to God in his mind. He's thanking God. He's praising God. He's asking God for help with things. He's just chewing the fat with God. He has a relationship with God. And that's what God loves. That's what God's wanted with us all along. Now, this last part is very important. Job eschewed evil. And that means that he shunned evil. He did not like evil. He tried to avoid evil. He did not endorse evil. And the Proverbs say a lot about the fear of the Lord. And in fact, Proverbs 8:13 says, "The fear of the Lord is to hate evil." That's what the fear of the Lord is. It is to hate evil. And it goes on to say, "Pride and arrogancy and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate." Okay, and that means, froward mouth means people who are habitually disobedient to God. They're always in opposition to God. But there's other proverbs that talk about that. Proverb 1:7, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Likewise, Proverbs 1:29, "For that they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord." Now, in those last two Proverbs, you see the fear of the Lord associated with knowledge and wisdom and instruction. And of course, this is knowledge in the ways of God, in the ways of the Lord. Wisdom of God. It's not talking about what you find at a university. It's not talking about what you find in a documentary on television. Those are great things to have if you have enough discernment to separate the wheat from the chaff, shall we say. But the fear of God means that you crave wisdom. You crave knowledge of God. And that's why someone like Job, who fears the Lord, is always conscious of God. God is always on his mind. That's the kind of relationship he has. And it goes back to what I said before about when you fall in love with someone, and at least initially, and hopefully for the rest of your life, but at least initially, that love is unconditional, unlike anything else you experience in life. Even for most people, I think it blows their own minds that they're capable of loving someone that much, because they know they have flaws, and yet they don't see them. And when you're dealing with God, he has no flaws. So you're feeling this absolute total love for someone who doesn't even have flaws all the time. That's the kind of thing that Job did, and that's what made Job a God-pleaser. That's why God later when he's talking to Satan and he refers to Job, God says to Satan, "Have you seen my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth?" And by the way, incidentally, this is a bit of a digression, but this is one reason why I believe that Job died before Abraham at least came of age, because it's referring to Job as there's no one like him in the earth. And clearly Abraham was of the same caliber in terms of his faith in God and his obedience to God and his trust in God. So that's one reason why I think Job came before Abraham. But the point is, he's saying that, have you regarded Job, my servant? There's none like him in the earth. God is speaking of Job, a human being, with the kind of pride that if we have a child who, wins the ball game or makes the honor roll or stars in the school play, we feel so much pride. That's how God's referring to a mere human being. Clearly, Job is doing something right, and he's doing something that other people are not doing, or at least he's doing it to a much, much more consistent degree. He is a God-pleaser. And that's ultimately what verse 1 is all about. It's pointing out that Job is a God-pleaser in a fallen world where people kind of run the gamut of somewhat pleasing God to absolutely angering God, even to the point where God would feel compelled with the flood to destroy the world and start over. So I just wanted to go over verse 1 a bit with that to show you the character of Job, because that's going to become relevant in a moment, because what we're going to find is that the people who came to comfort him, people who called themselves his friends, and they really meant to be his friends, but they're going to tear this man apart. They're going to tear this man apart as having done something terribly, terribly wrong to deserve the fate that he was suffering. And that's why it's so important to understand what verse 1 is saying. Verse 1 is saying, Job did not deserve what he got, period. End of story. Job, unless something comes up later in this story where Job really blows it, this is a man who did not deserve what he's about to get. Very, very important to understand. And in that way, Job is an image, and there's many images of Christ in the Old Testament. Joseph, for example. But Job is an image of Christ in that sense. Job did not deserve the punishment he got. It wasn't even punishment. It was just terrible circumstances. He wasn't being punished. He fell into bad circumstances because of this debate between God and Satan. And the fact is, he proved God's point. He shot down Satan's argument. And if you don't think, if there's anyone in heaven who is just swimming in rewards, it's going to be people like Job. So even though he went through all of that suffering, ultimately, he comes out ahead. And it's hard to know that when you're in that kind of intense suffering. It's very hard to know that. But Job, in his heart, knew it. He might have had trouble dealing with it in the here and now when he's suffering, but his reward in heaven most certainly is great. Okay, so with that, let's just take a quick look at Job chapter 1, verse 4. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, It may be that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. Now once again, what you're looking at there is a man who, it looks like he raised his children quite well. He has 7 sons and 3 daughters. They all get along famously. They feast and have a good time together each day of the week at one of the sons' houses. It looks like they rotate, one son for each day of the week. They invite their sisters to join them. There doesn't seem to be any real family discord here at all. And yet, Job understands human nature. He understands psychology quite well. He understands human nature very well, in part because he seeks such a close relationship with God. And for that reason, he just worries. He loves his children, and he worries that possibly while they're feasting and having a good time, you know what it is like when you get excited, perhaps they might curse God in their hearts. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It means that they're sinners, just like everyone else. And he, as a loving father, is trying to cover that by offering these sacrifices for each of his children. So this is a man who is just doing everything he possibly can to make everything right. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize what happened to Job because I think we're all familiar with it. Satan goes to and fro about the earth, tempting people, trying to cause trouble wherever he can. And when he successfully tempts someone to sin against God, he goes up to the throne of God and accuses them. That's why Satan is known as the accuser. And he says, see, look at that. They're sinning. They need to be punished. They have sinned against you. So one time, Satan was among a group of angels who came before the presence of the Lord, and God asked Satan, have you considered my servant Job? He is a perfect and upright man. There is none like him on the earth, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. And Satan, of course, responded by saying, well, certainly. I mean, you've given him everything he could possibly want. He has a wife and 10 children, a happy family. He's wealthy, he has land, he has animals, all this wealth, the respect of his peers. Of course he loves you. Of course he walks with you. Take those things away from him, and he'll curse you to your face. And God says, okay, I'm going to let you take away these things. Just do not hurt his person, and we'll see what he does. Now, God, of course, knew what Job was going to do, but Satan always has to prove his point. So this was meant, of course, to prove that Satan is a liar, that Satan is an accuser. That's all he does. He just accuses even the finest people out there, the people who really are after the heart of God. He will even look for reasons to accuse them. And in this case, he just had to make something up out of thin air. And here's where the sadness begins for Job. It's a day just like any other day, and these messengers start to arrive. And the first messenger arrives and says that the Sabaeans had fallen upon his servants, and they had taken away his oxen and his asses and murdered the servants. And he says, I alone escaped to tell you this story. Yet even as that messenger was speaking, another messenger arrived and said that the fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And again, only I survived to tell the story. And remember, the servants, it looks like Job treated his servants very well, almost as if they were members of the family. So we often look at what happens next where he loses 10 children, but he lost a lot of people who were close to him and who he cared about and who he had a responsibility to take care of and protect on this day. But yet, even as that messenger was finishing up his words, another messenger arrived, and he said that the Chaldeans had taken off with their camels and again had slain the servants who were taking care of the camels. So he's losing all of his wealth one after another. I mean, this could all literally happen in 2 or 3 minutes that he's hearing all of these stories. And then, of course, even as that messenger is speaking, another messenger arrives and says, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking in the eldest brother's house, and a whirlwind came and the house collapsed on them. Your children are dead, and only I have survived to tell the tale. Now that's beyond heartbreaking. I have lost, to bring this back to my story, I have lost everything I've worked for my entire life. It's me and the car that I live in, some clothes, some little things, but I have lost everything, not just material possessions, but what were my legacy in this world, all of the projects I was working on, because I don't have children. So these loud and violent neighbors and all of these Minnesota authorities who refused to do anything about it, they didn't just take my possessions, they took away my ability to leave behind the legacy that I had spent my entire life working on. That was going to be my gift to this world, to show that I had been here and that I cared about this world. And here's what I'm leaving behind to show you that I once existed. Please keep my memory alive, and may this make your lives going forward that much better. That's what all these people took away from me. And yet, for me, it took a total of about 4 years. These things kept happening to me day after day after day after day for 4 years. In a way, I mean, as bad as that is, in a way it's better than what Job had to go through, because Job had it all lost almost in an instant, all at once. He's just told he's lost this, he's lost that, and we can't calculate the number of people who were close to him when you look at his servants that were lost. Job's response, I will read this verse, Job 1, verse 20. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. So the point was made to Satan that he can accuse a man like Job all he wants, but the fact is, despite all of this loss, remember the point of fearing God and loving God with all, according to the greatest commandment, with all of your heart and soul and mind and strength, is that you do love God even more than your own family. And it doesn't mean you don't love your family. Of course you love your family. Job loved his family as much as you love yours. But he loved God, he understood his relationship with God, and there's an implication in there, in the context of the book of Job throughout the Bible. He knew he was going to see them again one day. So it was an earthly loss, and a massive one, about as bad as it could get. The only one he didn't lose was his wife, and it turns out that she wasn't much help, as you'll see when we get to the next chapter. So when God pointed this out to Satan, Satan, of course, came back and said, well, sure, you took away his stuff, but you didn't let me hurt his person. Let me afflict him personally, and then he will curse you to your face. And this time God gave Satan permission to harm Job physically, but not to kill him. And of course, that's exactly what Satan did. Next, Job ended up with these terrible, terrible boils all over his body. I mean, the Bible says that these boils went from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head, all over his body. And that means, he was using a potsherd to scrape himself. They're itching, they're just irritating, they're terrible, and they're all over his body. And think about it, they didn't have cozy water beds and such back then. No matter where he sat, no matter where he lay, he's going to be laying on these boils. And the irritation had to have been just horrible. You can almost imagine somebody who has third-degree burns all over their body. That's the kind of thing that Job was dealing with personally. And it's when this happened that his wife came to him. And if we look at Job chapter 2, verse 9, then said his wife unto him, Dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. But he said unto her, Thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this did not Job sin with his lips. So once again, even with this new disaster that had come to him, and even when his own wife told him, just curse God already and die, and yet Job refused to curse God. Now the way Job phrases it is to say, shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? Now that does not mean evil from God. The evil obviously comes from man and from Satan, but God allows it. But the point is, Job is looking at this through the eyes of incredible humility and understanding and wisdom. And if he had not walked with God so closely in all those prior years, he probably would have cursed God or otherwise gone off the handle. I mean, tolerating that magnitude of loss and pain and suffering and misery without, flying off the handle and becoming angry is extremely difficult. And I can only say that as these kinds of things have happened to me over all these 4 years, I have not been as good as Job. I certainly have not cursed God for it, but the anger certainly comes through. The injustice of it all comes through. And in that way, I try to learn something from Job. And a lot of that is because I myself had fallen away from God, mainly because I was working so hard. Ironically, I was working so hard for 7 years with this company that ended up, basically throwing me in the trash can, which contributed tremendously to the problems that I had here, contributed tremendously to me ending up losing everything I had and living in a car. But I worked so hard for that company that I really just kind of lost track of God, you might say. I was distracted by this job that took all my time. And when I got home, I had the other projects that I was working on. Like I said, those were to be my legacy. Prior to having that job, I was able to, both read the Bible and maintain my relationship with God and work on these projects. So my response might have been different than Job's. I don't claim to be perfect and upright as Job was. However, I was not going to curse God over it. It wasn't God who did these to me. It was my neighbors, my landlord, the police, Minnesota state officials, my former employer. They are the ones who engaged in this evil. It doesn't even occur to me to curse God for that. He didn't do it. They did. And it's the same way with Job here. He doesn't know where this is coming from. And this is where it ties into what I said before, that my situation was so surreal. I was not perfect. I'm not even going to call myself upright. However, I will say that compared to those around me, I do stand up for what is right, and I even take risks to do it. And frankly, I can't live any other way. And that is because I walk with God as closely as I'm able. I'm filled with that desire to do that. I hate evil. I eschew evil. And I try to pursue that which is good. I fail quite often. I'm not at all perfect like Job, but it meant a lot to me. It was always consciously on my mind, and it still is. So that's what Job and I have in common. The fact is, neither one of us deserved what we got. I did nothing wrong. I did absolutely nothing to make other people attack me the way they did. Torture and torment me inside my home, or to refuse to do their jobs, or to refuse to uphold our lease agreement that we had signed, or to terminate my employment with no advance notice. I didn't do those evil things, and I did not, compel other people to do those kinds of evil things. I didn't deserve it. Same thing with Job. Job did not deserve what he got. And when these things happen to you, especially when you don't deserve it, you have to try to figure out what is going on. And the book of Job does not go into great detail of that or what Job's internal response to this disaster was in his own mind. Although we certainly, once he starts to speak, we get a much better sense of what's going on in his mind. We don't know the timeline here, but the next thing the book of Job talks about after this conversation with his wife, who was, by the way, a miserable comforter. She tells him to curse God and die. That's a miserable comforter. We don't know how long Job suffered before his friends arrived, but in the very next verse here, chapter 2, verse 11, it says, "Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that was come upon him, they came every one from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, for they had made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him." So he has these 3 friends, and remember, back then, these were not like Babylon, cosmopolitan cities. They had large estates of land and, animals and servants and agriculture. So these friends, for them to find out about this, it had to have taken a little while for them to even find out about it. It doesn't sound like Job went around telling everyone. All of his servants were dead. His children were dead. Might have been his wife, might have been visitors, people who he traded with. The point is, it took some time for news to reach his three friends, and his three friends had to have been some distance away because it looks like they all had their own estates. And it says clearly they come from different places. So Job suffered with these boils and this anguish in his heart and soul of trying to find out, why did this happen to me? Why? On the one hand, I don't want to curse God for it. God has every right to do anything he wants to me, or he has every right to allow something to happen to me. But at the same time, I'm a human being and I can't help it. Why? Why me, and what am I supposed to do about it? When will this end? When will I wake up with these boils gone and this pain gone? So Job had to be suffering in that anguish for quite some time before his friends arrived, and we don't know how long. I've heard a couple scholars suggest maybe as much as a year, but I honestly have no idea if that would be the case or not. But the point is, when his friends arrived, and that was the first time that they had actually seen him in his condition. Chapter 2, verse 12 says, "And when they lifted up their eyes afar off and knew him not, they lifted up their voice and wept, and they rent every one his mantle, and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven." In other words, when it says, "and knew him not," that's the key point there. When they saw him, they didn't even recognize him. He was destroyed. He was a man who had been destroyed. And, throughout my website, as I have told my story on YouTube and on my website, I use the word destroyed. And it's because I am destroyed. Everything that was me has been taken away from me, except those things that are very internal in my heart. My temperament, my personality, those things remain intact, but they're very damaged. But every outward appearance, I don't smell good walking around. I wear the same clothes for a month. My hair has, obviously, you can tell, has grown long. And my body is not in any good condition at all. When you sit inside of a car for, say, 3 months straight, just sitting in the driver's seat, you lose a lot of control. You can probably tell I don't look like I'm crippled up here, but I certainly do look like I'm not as spry as I once was. And I'm telling you right now, I'm not as spry as I was 4 years ago, before my neighbors basically imprisoned me inside my home, and now have imprisoned me inside my car. So people wouldn't recognize me either. I've lost everything. The smile is gone. The joy is gone from my life. My sense of humor. I used to joke all the time. I used to laugh all the time. All that is gone. I feel really good speaking to you here. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, but the fact is, when I'm out there, I'm miserable, absolutely miserable. It is very difficult for me to laugh, to tell jokes, to see the joy in anything. I can't engage in any of the activities that gave me so much pleasure before. Playing guitar, making music, all the things I used to do on my computer, my writing and my research, it's all gone. For the last 3 months in particular, I have literally sat in the driver's seat of a car all the time. That's all I do, is just sit there and watch the world go by me, because I can't afford to do anything else. So if people who knew me before could see me now, they may not recognize me. And that's what Job had here with his friends. And it broke their heart. So clearly they cared about him. They engaged in the same traditional mourning gestures, throwing ashes on their heads, renting their mantles and such. But the thing is, in verse 13, we see what they did next. In verse 13, it says, "So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great." So, again, get the picture of this. His friends had met from diverse places, After hearing about this, they didn't know exactly what had happened. They'd heard the details of losing his children, certainly, and his wealth. But when they saw him, they were rather shocked by his condition, and they didn't know what to say. But they were there to comfort him, and they cared about him. So they sat down next to him for 7 days and 7 nights, and they didn't say a word. Why? Because they saw that his grief was very great. And you know what? Sometimes when someone is grieving terribly, doing what they did means more than any words they could speak. Because we all know they can't understand the kind of loss he suffered. But for them to be there in his presence is a show of solidarity. It's a sacrifice of their time. It's a sacrifice of 7 days of their life. They're not engaging in conversation or out doing things that they want to do with their life. They are showing how much they love and care about Job by doing that. And that means so much to somebody who is grieving and suffering, especially when it's something so internalized that other people really cannot relate to it. The only way you're going to relate to it is through empathy. And empathy is not only a matter of the heart, it's also a critical thinking skill. And what we're going to see in the next chapters, and again, I'm not going to read verses here, I'm just going to describe this rather briefly, in fact, because much of the rest of the book of Job is about conversations between these three friends and Job. Because let's go to chapter 3 and just see what happened when he does start to speak. Chapter 3, verse 1, and this is after the 7 days and 7 nights of quiet. Verse 1, after this opened Job his mouth and cursed his day. And Job goes on to curse the day he was born. He is now letting it all out. He can't hold it in anymore. Now, that's not to say he isn't grateful for what his friends have done by sitting there in silence next to him. He most certainly does. But he can't hold it in anymore. He has to let it out. And his friends allowing him to do that, let him get it off his chest, is the best thing that they could do. Because again, they can't offer him any answers. Nobody knows why this happened to Job. He's the one person it shouldn't have happened to. He didn't deserve it. And again, I just want to briefly tell you what happened with me. In my case, what really was the beginning of the end. This was a progression toward the end, because when the police failed me so miserably and basically traumatized me inside my own home, so that from then on I held a telephone in my hand every day, but I couldn't call anybody. If the police only traumatize you when they come over to your home, who are you supposed to call? That was the beginning of the end, but the real end was when my former employer just laid me off with no advance notice, didn't even let me speak to my coworkers who I had sat next to for 7 years. I'd watched their children grow 7 years older during that period. I'd watched them get married. I had been with these people for 7 years. I wasn't even allowed to say goodbye to them or to get their contact information or anything. So I was thrown out completely alone into this torture chamber of a home by my employer who I had served so faithfully for so many years. And yet, to add insult to injury, this employer spends a lot of time and resources portraying itself as exceedingly ethical, if you can believe that. They have a big ethics policy. They will not stop talking about how ethical they are. And it's a shame, because maybe if they stopped talking about it, they could actually start to be ethical. So this is the kind of pain that I was enduring, this kind of just one after another, absurdity, injustice, and just evil viciousness. First from my neighbors, and then from my landlord, his response, which was to blame the victim. From the police in the city, their response was to blame the victim and say that they're not going to do their jobs, even as they accept a paycheck. And now, at this time, here I am. I don't have a paycheck. I did my job faithfully. In fact, I went way above and beyond what my job was, without any extra pay for all those years. And that's just my work ethic. And yet, here I am with no paycheck, living in a car, basically waiting to die. While all those people who did this to me not only did not do the job they're paid to do to help me in the first place, but for the last year and a half or so that I've been suffering without a job, they've been getting paid week after week after week. I mean, the injustice and the agony that just piles on you as that goes on and on and on without anyone ever doing anything about it, ever. There's no legal remedy. There's nothing I can do about it. That pain is just tremendous. So what happened with me in terms of friends? Well, these coworkers, I wasn't allowed to make any contact with them. I couldn't say goodbye. You know, my coworkers, who were about the only people I really knew in Minnesota, because again, I had spent this 7 years working so hard that I had abandoned just about everything else. The only thing I had really done was, working toward this goal. I had a 10-year plan to move away and open up my own little shop, and I was working toward that. Otherwise, all I was doing was working at my job, and by that time, I had lost touch with everyone else I knew all around the country. The only people I knew were these coworkers, and they were gone when I was laid off with no advance notice. I mean, it was the most cruel and vicious. I can't call it, given that my employer knew the situation I was in, I can't call it anything but evil. It was just pure evil. It was the kind of evil that visited Job here, that Satan had brought to his family. It was just pure evil. And I had to sit there alone in this torture chamber and try to sort this out and figure this out and figure out, why did this happen and what can I possibly do about it? I can't even trust the people who were closest to me. So I didn't have 3 friends come over, and in fact, I'm not sure, other than one instance when I moved, I haven't even seen any of these people since this began. Job had 3 friends travel quite a distance and spend 7 days sitting there in silence to show their support for him. That had to do wonders for him. And I had nothing of the kind. So there's your first lesson, I guess you could say, about how to comfort other people. When someone goes through the loss of literally everything that is their entire life, ignoring them isn't the best answer. And I did get some things like texts and emails and such, but we'll get into that in a bit. They hurt more than they helped by far. In fact, they just added insult to injury. What I did not get were friends who said, wow, I know what this is like. I'm going to use, my empathy, my concern for other people, for this friend or this coworker, this person I've known for 7 years, and I'm going to go visit them. We are going to go visit this person and show him solidarity, show him that we care. Even if we don't know what to say, we don't have to say anything. Just being there will lift his spirits, and it would have, but nobody did that. So what Job did was he started lashing out, cursing the day he was born. He didn't curse God. He cursed the day he was born. He said, it would be better if I had never been born. If I had never been born, I wouldn't be going through this misery. Now, unfortunately, that is regarded as somewhat sinful because, if God brings you into this world, that is quite an honor, and there's a purpose for that. But that's the kind of pain he was going through. And just to summarize what happens with the rest of this, many chapters coming up, once Job opened his mouth and all he did was say what was on his mind, he said what was in his heart, he tried to use words to express the magnitude of agony and just pain and misery and suffering and anguish. He tried to use words to do that. And the minute he opened his mouth to do that, his friends pounced on him. Rather than realizing that he was doing a good thing, that was good for him, to let it all out, they immediately turned it around and they started blaming him. They started questioning what he was saying. They just started, they weren't showing any signs of real friendship at that point. They really looked like enemies at a certain point. And that's what I did. I let it all out in writing, which is very, very therapeutic. And I created my website, Meannesota.com, where I told the whole story. the whole story, not just what happened to me, as in terms of complaining about what happened to me, but I laid out a legal case. It made a legal case against my neighbors, my landlord, the police, all the way up to the very top. Frankly, all the way up to the governor's office, the governor of the state of Minnesota. It made this case, and that was therapeutic for me to write that. It was the only outlet that I had. I had nobody to talk to because, again, everybody just deserted me when I lost my job. And I ended up being basically imprisoned inside just my bedroom, not my apartment. I couldn't use my apartment because of the loud and violent noise. I was stuck in one corner of my bedroom, often laying in the fetal position on the floor. That's how miserable it was. And I got no sympathy from other people. My coworkers they didn't call me. It was as if I had disappeared or they had disappeared. They just disappeared from my life. And when I did create my website, and that's where I let all this out, and it was not only to let all of the pain and anguish out the only way I could as a form of therapy, but it was also, again, to make this legal case because I still had hope in my heart that somebody in Minnesota would recognize how unjust this is. Nobody should have to lose everything they've spent nearly a half a century working hard and honestly for, just because everyone around them refuses to do their job, or everyone around them engages in lies and deceit and backstabbing evil. And not one of them is punished, but I lose absolutely everything. I honestly believed that somebody somewhere, an attorney or someone, or that groups of people with picket signs would see the website and they would go, my goodness, this is unbelievable. This is epic failure on the part of the state of Minnesota. They have destroyed this man's life. We need to reverse this. We need to right this wrong, to turn this injustice into something that can resemble justice, given how much he's already lost. He's lost absolutely everything. And instead, nobody's cared. Nobody's cared about the website. Nobody. They just don't care. But a couple of the people I knew from work found out about the website, and they started contacting me. And the thing is, as they contacted me, what they said was very similar to what Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar said to Job. Because once Job opened his mouth, once he began to release it verbally, like I did on my website, his friends started to tear into him. They started to attack him. They started to say, it's all your fault. You must have done something wrong, or else God would not have done this to you. They began to use, proverbs of the day, those generalities, but they're not laws, but general ways of living. The good man does not suffer God's wrath, those kinds of things. And frankly, that one's probably a law, but, the good man does not suffer. The evil man, gets his just reward. Those kinds of sayings and proverbs that they had back then, just like we do today. And they start quoting these things to him. But the thing is, rather than looking at those as proverbs, as just generalities, they're looking at them as natural laws. They're not saying, well, generally good people, these kinds of bad things don't happen to them. God doesn't let it happen. They're saying, if this happened to you, then you did something wrong, period, end of story. Because this couldn't happen to you unless you had done something wrong. And that's what his friends kept doing over and over. And they got so vicious. I mean, at one point in these conversations where Job is immediately put on the defensive and he has to defend himself and defend what he's saying and defend what he's done, when his friends don't know anything about this. They don't know what he's done. They weren't there. They live far, far away. They're making assumptions. But at one point, Bildad even said, your children must have been terrible people. They must have been rotten sinners like you to have God wipe them all out like that. I mean, what kind of a comforter says that to their so-called friends? And yet I had basically the same thing from my so-called friends, the very few that did contact me. Like I said, when they contacted me by text or by email, it was things like, well, I told you before, you should have just moved away from those neighbors. You should have just moved away. which is the equivalent of saying, it's all your fault. Now, half my website talks about why I did not move away and why I should not have moved away. It was a bad idea all around. It would have increased my rent by at least $200 a month. That's more than $1,000 a year I would have lost going forward forever just because I ran away from people who were breaking the law. But from a moral standpoint, there were laws in place against this noise. It was in our lease agreement not to make this noise. So for me to run away rather than demanding that these authorities enforce the law and enforce the lease, for me to do that would have been endorsing lawlessness. Now, what did we just say about Job here being perfect and upright? And again, I can never, ever claim to be perfect or upright, but I do eschew evil. I hate evil, and I love truth, and I love what is good. I do not endorse lawlessness. I do not like lawlessness, and I cannot morally support lawlessness. But those laws against noise and noise harassment of neighbors were put in place to provide a mechanism so that I would not have to move away in response to loud and violent neighbors. The whole point of the law is to provide a mechanism so that the police can come in or the landlord can come in and remove the offender, remove the perpetrator, and then I don't have to move away. I don't have to end up paying $200 a month more for rent going forward. And I don't have to go through the time of moving, all the effort that is involved in packing up, moving, unpacking, getting settled again. Plus, I already lived as close to where I worked as really I probably could have, so I would have ended up living further away, which means I could no longer walk to work if I had to, and I would be burning more gasoline, spending more money on gasoline, and because the police don't do anything about noise, I could just as easily, after spending all that money and effort, move into the same situation where my new neighbors are just as loud because nobody's doing anything about them either. So for anybody to say to me, why didn't you just move away? You should have just moved away. That is blaming the victim. That doesn't even address the people who are committing acts of evil, who are committing acts of violence against me. It doesn't even address it. It seeks to blame me. Somehow it's my fault because I didn't move away and bear all that expense going forward. And incidentally, if I had moved away and ended up paying more rent like that, then when I lost my job, which was shortly thereafter, I would not have been able to pay the rent and I would have been evicted. That's yet another reason I did not want to move away. So I had very good reasons for not moving away. For anyone to tell me that it's my fault because I didn't move away is worse than a slap in the face. It's blaming the victim. It is morally repugnant. It is sickening. And it's what Job's friends here are doing to him. They're looking for a reason that Job must have done something. In the privacy of his own home, he must have sinned against God. He must have done something, because if he had not done something wrong, he would not have endured this magnitude of disaster. That's what his friends are telling him. But the thing is, as they do this, they are appearing less and less as friends. In fact, almost immediately, they don't appear as friends anymore. Almost from the minute they open their mouth, they don't look like friends. If you jumped into the book of Job right at the point where his friends start speaking to him, and you didn't know what happened previously, except that Job went through this terrible, awful situation, you would think he's surrounded by enemies. You wouldn't even think that those were his friends. The only reason you know they're his friends is because previous verses of the Bible said that they were his friends, but their behavior made them look like they were just trolls, like they were there to add as much to his misery as they possibly could, to just make him feel as bad as he possibly could, make him want to die. And I guess this is the point I really want to make with my experience. My neighbor's noise prevented me from getting things done at home. It prevented me from working on my projects. It prevented me from sleeping, which affected my work. But that alone was not the problem. Even as it went on and on for quite a while, if somebody had stopped it, I could have almost immediately gotten back to a normal life. The things that traumatized me, the things that stole from me, things I can never get back, ever, like faith in my fellow man. The things that were stolen from me were stolen by my landlord and by the police and by my former employer, who just stabbed me in the back unlike anything I've experienced. And these so-called friends who called me up and basically blamed me. If they didn't blame me because I didn't move away, then they blamed me because I had spent all this time writing this website. Look at all the time you spent on this website. One of these people said that. Look at how many hours you've spent on this website. You could have been doing this, that, and the other thing in the meantime. They're not even comprehending what trauma is. Okay, they didn't call me up and take me out to dinner. They were among a group of people who came over and sat next to me in silence for 7 days to make me feel better. They abandoned me. They left me completely alone. I was completely alone, laying on the fetal position on the one corner of the floor of my bedroom. These people didn't come and talk to me. The only outlet I had was that website. And the website turned out to be a really good website. It actually is very useful for explaining a massive problem in the state of Minnesota, which is what I call Meannesota. And yet, what do these same people who didn't provide me with any other outlet do? They complain about the fact that I spend all that time on the website. So once again, they're blaming the victim. It's all your fault. When I was just doing exactly what Job did here. Job had 3 people in front of him where he could let it all out. He could get it off of his chest. I had 0 people because they just deserted me. They just showed me to the door that I'd gone through for 7 years at work and sent me on my way. Never talked to me again. The only outlet I had was that website. And yet they blame me for working on the website. So you can see the parallels here are basically Job and I both lost everything, essentially everything that was our life. The only thing Job was left with was his wife, and as you could tell from her response, he could have been left with something better. And the other thing in common is that neither of us deserved it. I did nothing wrong. I did nothing to force other people to refuse to do their jobs. I did nothing to force my neighbors to make loud and violent noise and to terrorize and torment me inside my home. Job did nothing to deserve, absolutely nothing to deserve what he got. He was just being a good man day after day after day, and one day it was all taken away, and he never knew why. And that's how I feel. I don't know why. I don't understand how 5 million Minnesotans can be this cruel and heartless. Even as I've had the website out there and my videos, even as I reach more people, even as I went to 100, I hate to say this here in the sanctuary, but I went to 100 churches in Minnesota. And they did absolutely nothing to help. Nothing. They didn't even care. In fact, they didn't even want to hear it. They wouldn't even go as far as Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar did. They spent 7 days in silence, and then they listened to Job let it all out. These people wouldn't even give me that much time. I was lucky if I got 5 minutes from any of these people before they started looking at their watch and starting to back away, and I got to pick up my daughter. I got an appointment. That's the way I was treated by, actually, in the end, at this point, about 115 churches in the state of Minnesota. And I have a video on my website that explains that their behavior is the behavior of Antichrist. It opposes Christ. And that's a hard thing to say, but it's what happened. And when you look at the way, particularly that Bildad treated Job, I mean, without having any facts to base this on at all, just because he doesn't understand what's going on, he makes these assumptions, comes right out to Job, who's sitting there still with all these boils all over his body, and says, your children must have been rotten sinners to get this kind of a judgment from God. And what he's implying is they must have been rotten sinners like you are, Job, because that's why this happened to you. Now, the only thing that Job and I do not have in common in our stories is that Job was restored. He was vindicated and he was restored. Whereas I appear to be headed toward being exterminated. I'm living in that car. I have no food. I have no money. I have no income. It is effectively illegal or unfeasible / impractical for a homeless person to work in the state of Minnesota. The state of Minnesota has set up a system off camera where you don't see it on television, where the homeless people are basically being killed off. At the very best, they're going to live the lives of a beggar holding a sign at a street corner and then go live in the mud where they get harassed by the police and by everyone around them. I was raised to be a professional. I went to college to be a professional. I want to have a home, and that's what I've been fighting for rather than standing on a street corner with a sign. If I don't get some help from people who care about me, I'm going to die from this. And that's after taking it to all of these Minnesotans for now 4 years. It has now been 4 years I've been raising these issues with Minnesotans, and nobody has helped. What they have done is blame the victim. You should have moved away. It's all your fault. You shouldn't have spent all that time working on that website. It's all your fault. Because of the book of Job, these kinds of people are now what is known as Job's comforters. Job himself, when he had had enough with these people, he said, "You are miserable comforters." Miserable comforters. And I know exactly how Job felt when the last thing he had to cling to for any sense of security or happiness in this world were his friends. And they let him down as well by blaming him instead of just helping him. Now, in Job's case, helping him was going to be difficult because these appeared to be acts of God. They were acts of Satan, but they appeared to be acts of God. What could they do about these boils and everything? What could they do about his children? Nothing. But they could continue to comfort him. They could be there for him. They could not judge him, not blame him, not accuse him. He already has Satan in heaven accusing Job at the throne of God. He already has Satan accusing him. Does he really need his friends accusing him? Miserable comforters are you all, is what Job said. And that is exactly what I've experienced. People who I regarded as friends and frankly as family, considering that they were the only people I dealt with for 7 years. As I worked so hard that I lost track of all the truly good friends, the really, truly good friends that I had had in the past, people who never would have treated me that way. I lost contact with them because I worked so hard at this job that threw me into the trash. And those people turned out to be miserable comforters. And they just added to my pain, they added to my trauma, and they added to my desire to curse the day I was born and to wish that I was dead. And you have to ask the question, what kind of a friend are you when you go to comfort someone and when you leave, the person you just comforted now wishes they were dead because of what you said to them? That's a pretty miserable comforter. Now, I'm going to tell you the end of this story, again, without getting into the verses because we're short on time, but in the end, at some point, God finally had enough of this back and forth because basically what happened throughout the book of Job is this tag team of 3 so-called friends who just keep attacking Job one after another, and then Job has to try to defend himself over and over. And when we read it as outside observers, the only person who's making any rational sense is Job. And yet Job is suffering tremendously. He's totally distraught. He's totally traumatized, and yet he's the only one who makes sense. But these 3 friends, they just play off of each other, and and they can't even realize that they're making no sense at all. It's like a mini cult mentality, and cult mentality is exactly what I've been describing on my website as the reason why, out of 5 million Minnesotans, they didn't do anything to save my life. They just added insult to injury and heaped and piled more misery and suffering on top of me every time they opened their mouth or every time they refused to do anything, every time they took any action at all. Miserable comforters are they all. But after this back and forth, there were 3 rounds of this back and forth. Finally, as Job tries to answer these people, he's getting very upset. And unfortunately, as he does so, he is starting to, the influence of his friends is making him lash out, not to curse God, but to sin against God in the sense that he's questioning God. He's asking God, explain to me why you did this. And at some point, God had had enough, and God comes down and speaks to these men. And one of the things he says, it's the famous interrogation of Job from God, who asks him, where were you when I created all of this? Who are you to ask me to explain to you why I'm doing what I'm doing? And you know what? Throughout the book of Job, God never even tells Job that this was to prove a point to Satan. Some people phrase it as, made a bet with Satan. This wasn't a bet. This was to prove a point. This was to condemn Satan. And like I said before, Job is experiencing tremendous rewards in heaven for eternity because of this. In the end, it all works out. But that doesn't deny the fact that the misery and suffering that he endured throughout this period before he was restored was horrible. And among the very worst things that he experienced was having his own friends, his own comforters, attack him rather than help him. My friends could have taken up a collection early on, gotten enough money, come to me without blaming me at all, and instead just saying, we are so happy that we are able to help you like this. Please take this money and go restore yourself. And the only thing we ask is that once you're restored, go out and do something nice like that for someone else, like you did in the past. That's all they had to do, and I wouldn't be in the situation I'm in today. But they couldn't do that. Instead, they had to come to me, and it was always, here's some help, but it's only on the condition that you let us sit there and tell you everything you did wrong, how it's all your fault, how you should have moved away, how you shouldn't have spent all your time on this website. If you let us condemn you like this, then here's a little bit of help. And obviously, that's not the kind of help I want to take. The strings that are attached to that are, they reach down to hell. But no one else has given me the kind of help they could have. Unlike Job, where his friends literally couldn't do anything for him. They couldn't bring his children back. They couldn't bring his servants back, his wealth. They couldn't fix these boils all over his body. My friends could have restored me completely. Completely. I didn't have to lose really much of anything that I owned, that I had worked so hard for all those years. And instead, I lost absolutely everything. And the people who really could have prevented that and who I really would have expected to prevent that were the ones who ended up being miserable comforters, my so-called friends, the people I was closest to. Now, after God interrogates Job, Job repents, and that's really all God wanted. God was upset with Job in this instance, but let's face it, he wasn't sinless. We all know that. He was perfect and upright, but he was not sinless. God forgave him. God restored him. Okay, he got back twice of what he had before. But at the same time, he really became angry with these miserable comforters, with Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And he said, God's attitude toward those 3 comforters was, you don't even know what you're talking about. You weren't there. You have no idea what Job went through. You have no idea what Job did. and you just came up with all these crazy ideas on your own. It must be Job's fault. He should have done this. He should not have done that. Just because you couldn't deal with the fact that you didn't understand it, that his intense suffering made you a little bit uncomfortable. And for that reason, to make sure that you're a little less uncomfortable, you would heap all of this abuse on your friend. God was very upset with these miserable comforters because their behavior had just been abominable. Their treatment of Job, their arrogance, their narcissism, it was just all about them. They didn't like seeing Job in this state. They didn't like feeling that uncomfortable. But because they were only concerned with themselves more than anything else, they were even willing to heap more abuse on Job just to help lighten their load so that they would feel a bit better about it. And God told them to, basically make some restitution to Job for that, to give him some of their wealth. And that presumably is what helped him become reestablished where Job was fully restored. In fact, he was restored with twice as much wealth as he had had previously. And that's something that's not happening to me. You see, the book of Job has been out there now for some 4,000 years. The lessons have been there for people to learn. And the problem is, God does not step down every time this happens to someone. We were supposed to learn these lessons. And if these miserable comforters who made me just want to die when they came to, quote, help me, if these so-called friends who made me want to die by their treatment of me had learned anything at all from this 4,000-year-old book, maybe they would have behaved a little bit differently. Maybe they would have realized that the best thing they could do for me was, A, to be in my presence. I don't need a text. I don't need an email. It would be nice to have a hug, some kind of human contact, so that I'm contacting something other than one area of the floor in my bedroom. But the only offers I got for people to come and see me were tied to these insults. You should have moved away. It's all your fault. Shouldn't spend all that time on your website. It's all your fault. The book of Job is there to give us not just guidance on how to have the patience of Job, how to deal with adversity, how to handle losing everything in this world, which, of course, the way you handle that is by retaining what you have in that world, retaining your relationship with God. But it's also a guidebook for all of us to learn how to comfort the people we love and care about properly, without adding insult to injury, without making matters worse. And that is the lesson that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar teach us by messing everything up the way they did. And it breaks my heart, again, that after 4,000 years, the people who were there supposedly to comfort me were oblivious to this message. Now, the fact is, those few people from my workplace who tried to comfort me and they failed so miserably, I don't really have any evidence that they are Christian. I don't have any evidence that they've ever read the book of Job, let alone that they understand what that book is about. But as I said before, I went to more than 100 churches in the state of Minnesota, Christian churches, and I got the same results. They wouldn't even allow me to just get it off my chest and tell my story. They did not visit my website and read my story with the documentation. Reading that kind of thing is like when you read a book and it inspires you to take action. You read a book about some terrible injustice, or you see a 60 Minutes news report about a terrible injustice and you feel compelled to take some action. So you join an organization, or at least you send off a letter, or at the very least an email to your legislator. You do something about it. That's what my website was for. That's why it's so well documented. That's why it makes a legal case. But as near as I can tell, almost nobody has read the whole thing. And it's not because it's a bad website. It's very good. The people who have read all the way through it have said it's pretty amazing. And I put a lot of effort into that. It was both therapy to help me get through this, but it was also setting the stage for the next action, which should have been for me to get justice in this matter. But instead, because most people refuse to even read the website and go through it and to see my story as if it was a book that they bought at the bookstore, they're not taking any action to see that I get any justice. And that includes more than 100 Minnesota Christian churches. They have no excuse for being oblivious to the lessons of a 4,000-year-old book called the Book of Job. The way I was treated by those churches broke my heart. It left me in tears. Not for me, but for the state of God's church in this world. And if, as many people believe, we are in the end times, we are in the last of the latter days, the days that immediately precede the second coming of Christ and the establishment of his kingdom on earth, if that is the period that we're in, then I hope you will understand why that brought me to tears. And I almost hope you will experience those kinds of tears yourself, because that is the state, at least in Minnesota, of God's church. I came to them for help to save my life. Unlike Job, who had these boils and he had all this wealth that was taken away from him. Yes, I had all my wealth taken away from me, but those are just possessions. The thing was, my life was eminently at risk, and it still is. And these Minnesota churches did absolutely nothing. They didn't care. They didn't even want to hear it. If you can believe it, what they consistently did, if they did anything at all, was to hand me a stack of papers that had a bunch of government agencies' phone numbers on them. They were sending me to the very institution that had done this to me in the first place. The reason the book of Job is so relevant to us today, a 4,000-year-old book, is because if we read it and if we learn the lessons of it, we learn not only how to handle terrible adversity in our own lives, but we learn how to help and comfort and restore other people who are going through that kind of adversity. And instead of relying on God to come down to earth every single time and to yell at the bad guys and to restore the person who was hurt, the purpose of the church is to glorify God by doing that with joy in their hearts. If these Minnesota churches had restored me to a life worth living so that I was no longer at risk of dying, no longer sleeping in a car, no longer not contributing to society as an unemployed person, if they had helped me with these things, they, as the church, would have glorified God. God set the example of what they were supposed to do in the book of Job, but they didn't do it. They did absolutely nothing. And you know what? That's exactly the complaint I had against the civil authorities. My neighbors, my landlord, the police, every Minnesota state authority, all the way up to the governor's office. They did absolutely nothing. So I know it took quite a long time to get to this point, but I hope that with everything I just shared with you, I hope this really touches your heart, and I hope you understand what it is I'm saying. And I hope you'll go home and not just read the book of Job, but study the book of Job. It is one of the most neglected books in the Bible. It has far more to say than about the topic of patience, the patience of Job. There is so much more in there. When God interrogated Job, there's more science in there than there probably is in the rest of the Bible combined. Again, the oldest surviving book in Western civilization, and it is pointing out aspects of science that weren't known until very recently. It's showing clearly that even back then they had some understanding of how the natural world works. Why have we lost our way with modern science? Why has modern science become an enemy of God, when in the book of Job it was perfectly consistent with God? See, there's a lot of questions in the book of Job, and that's what we need to look at. So I encourage you all to go home, read the book of Job. It doesn't hurt to get a good commentary, but read the book yourself. Let it touch your heart, and let the Holy Spirit work in you and show you these lessons. And listen to the recording of this talk again if you want to. Maybe the second time around, you'll see why I spent so much time on the preliminaries, more than an hour just leading up to, telling you my story and then telling you about, the history of the book of Job. There's a reason I did that. You'll notice I only spent maybe, relatively few minutes talking about Job's comforters, even though that's the whole point of this entire talk tonight. And it's because we're all familiar with being comforters. It's all these preliminaries that we've neglected to think about. But those preliminaries are what set the stage to help you understand how to be a good comforter. So the next time you encounter somebody, whether it's a friend or a family member, your child, your parent, somebody who's really close to you, and they go through a terrible, terrible time, it's worth spending some time in the book of Job learning how to be a good comforter rather than a miserable comforter. And if there's anything that you or other people in your circles can do to help that person, to right a wrong, to make an injustice just, to restore a person who has been devastated or, like in my case, just absolutely destroyed, then maybe by looking at the book of Job a little more closely, you'll have the tools to do that for these people that you care about, and you will not become, quite by accident, unintentionally, a miserable comforter. And that is really about all I have to say to you tonight. I want to thank you again so much for the opportunity to speak to you here tonight. I can't tell you how much it means to me. You've just heard my story, so I think you have some idea of how I have nobody to talk to, how nobody cares whether I live or die out there in Minnesota. So I just want you to know from the bottom of my heart, it means the world to me that I was able to come here and speak to you today, because I'm not lying. If I didn't have this opportunity, I would just be speaking to the rocks and the snow. Thank you all so much, everyone.